Imagine you are living in a bustling city in the year 165. Life is good. The markets are full of spices from the east. The Roman legions are securing the borders. And the Emperor Marcus Aurelius is seen as a wise, steady hand at the wheel. But then, a few soldiers returning from a campaign in the Near East start coughing. They develop a strange fever and dark spots on their skin. Within weeks, the most powerful empire the world has ever seen is brought to its knees, not by an invading army, but by something so small it couldn't even be seen. This was the Antonine Plague, and it was the first time humanity truly realized that our greatest vulnerabilities aren't always on a battlefield. Today we are peeling back the layers of time to look at the moments when our biological resilience was tested to the absolute limit. We are exploring the health crises that didn't just change medicine, but toppled empires, reshaped economies, and altered the very DNA of our civilization. When we talk about the Antonine Plague, we are looking at a turning point in history. Before this event, Rome was expanding, confident, and wealthy. After it, the empire entered a long period of decline. It is estimated that up to a quarter of the population in some areas vanished. Think about what that does to a society. The tax base disappears, the army shrinks, the farms go untended. This wasn't just a medical emergency, it was a systemic collapse. Marcus Aurelius himself struggled to keep the gears of state turning, while a massive portion of his citizenry was incapacitated. This event taught the ancient world a harsh lesson. Global trade and connected empires are a double-edged sword. The same roads that brought silk and gold also brought invisible hitchhikers that didn't care about imperial borders. But if the Antonine Plague was a warning, the mid-6th century brought a full-scale catastrophe. In the year 541, during the reign of Emperor Justinian, a new affliction arrived in Constantinople. At its peak, historians say thousands of people were being affected every single day in the capital alone. The descriptions from the time are harrowing. People would be walking down the street and suddenly collapse. The emperor himself fell ill but managed to survive, though his dream of reuniting the old Roman Empire was effectively ended. The labor shortage was so severe that construction stopped. Food production plummeted, and the Byzantine Empire was left so weakened that it could no longer defend its vast territories. This crisis played a massive role in ushering in what we now call the Middle Ages. It was a dark curtain falling over the Mediterranean world, and it wouldn't truly lift for centuries. What is fascinating about these early crises is the total lack of understanding. People thought the air was corrupt or that they were being punished by divine forces. This lack of knowledge created a secondary crisis of fear. When you don't know how a threat moves or how to stop it, the social fabric starts to tear. People fled the cities, inadvertently carrying the problem to the countryside. Communities turned inward, becoming suspicious of outsiders. It's a recurring theme. The biological threat is the spark, but the human response is the fuel that determines how much of the world burns. Fast forward to the 14th century, and we encounter the big one, the Great Mortality of the 1340s. We've all seen the imagery of the era, but the reality was far more complex. This crisis traveled along the Silk Road, hitching a ride on the very veins of global commerce that linked China to Europe. When it hit the port cities of the Mediterranean, it was like a tidal wave. In the span of just a few years, it is estimated that nearly half of Europe's population was gone. But here is the strange paradox of history. This absolute disaster actually laid the groundwork for the modern world. Because there were so few workers left, the value of labor skyrocketed. For the first time, peasants could demand wages and better living conditions. The old feudal system, which had kept people tied to the land for centuries, simply broke apart. This forced innovation. With fewer hands to do the work, people had to invent labor-saving devices, eventually leading to the technological leaps of the Renaissance. But the 14th century wasn't just a European event. It devastated the Islamic world and China as well. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt saw its economy shattered. The Mongol Empire, already overextended, began to fragment as trade routes became ghost trails. This was a truly global health crisis that reset the balance of power across Eurasia. It showed that no matter how advanced a civilization thinks it is always just one biological shift away from a total reboot. As we move into the age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, the nature of health crises changed again. This time, it was a collision of worlds. When outsiders arrived in the Americas, they brought with them a suite of ailments that the local populations had never encountered. This wasn't a single event, but a cascading series of waves. Smallpox, measles, the flu. The impact was arguably the greatest demographic shift in the history of our species. Within a century, civilizations like the Aztec and the Inca, which featured massive cities and complex social structures, were reduced to fragments. It is estimated that upwards of 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas disappeared. This wasn't a conflict of weapons as much as it was a conflict of biology. The very landscape of the continents changed. Forests grew back over abandoned cities, and some scientists believe this massive regrowth of vegetation actually sucked enough carbon out of the atmosphere to contribute to a global cooling period known as the Little Ice Age. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of the urban crises. As cities like London, Paris, and Philadelphia grew, they became breeding grounds for various afflictions. The Great Plague of London in 1665 was a focal point of this era. People were trapped in their homes, marked with red crosses, while the wealthy fled to the countryside. It was during this time that Isaac Newton, a young student at the time, was sent home from university for safety. While in isolation, he did his most groundbreaking work on calculus and gravity. It's a reminder that even in the midst of a health crisis, the human mind refuses to shut down. We find ways to use the quiet moments to reshape our understanding of the universe. By the 19th century, the enemy changed again. This was the century of cholera. As the Industrial Revolution took hold, people crammed into cities that didn't have the infrastructure to support them. Sewage ran in the streets and leaked into the water supply. Between the 1830s and the 1860s, a series of global outbreaks originated in India and spread across the globe. This was a crisis of the modern age, driven by steamships and rapid travel. But this crisis also gave birth to modern public health. In London, a doctor named John Snow mapped out the cases and realized they were all clustered around a specific water pump. By simply removing the handle of that pump, he proved that the water was the carrier. This led to the Great Stink of London and the subsequent building of massive sewer systems. It was the first time humanity used data and engineering to fight back against a biological threat on a grand scale. The 19th century also saw the fight against yellow fever and malaria, particularly in the tropics. These were the hidden guardians that made it incredibly difficult for outside empires to maintain a presence in areas like the Caribbean or West Africa for a long time. It wasn't until scientists realized that mosquitoes were the delivery system that the map of the world truly opened up for global projects like the Panama Canal. This transition from mysterious vapor to scientific understanding is the most important journey humanity has ever taken. Then we hit the 20th century. In 1918, just as the First Global War was ending, a new respiratory threat emerged. It was a version of the flu, but it was unlike anything seen before. It didn't just affect the very young or the very old, it was most dangerous for healthy young adults in the prime of their lives. This was a crisis of the lost generation. Millions of people who had survived the trenches of Europe returned home, only to succumb to this invisible force. The speed was terrifying. In some cities, you could be perfectly healthy in the morning and gone by nightfall. It moved so fast that the world's medical systems were simply overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors worked until they collapsed. This event led to a massive overhaul of how we track illnesses globally, eventually leading to the creation of international health organizations. The mid-20th century brought the era of polio. While not as widespread in terms of numbers as the flu, its impact was deeply psychological. It affected children, leaving many with permanent challenges. The images of iron lungs, massive metal cylinders used to help people breathe, became a symbol of the era's anxiety. But this crisis also sparked one of the greatest collaborative efforts in history. The race for a vaccine became a matter of national pride and global necessity. When Jonas Salk finally announced a success in 1955, the world celebrated as if a war had ended, and in many ways it had. We had finally learned how to proactively prevent a crisis before it could start. But as we grew more confident, new challenges emerged. The late 20th century saw the arrival of a blood-borne crisis that completely redefined how we think about social responsibility and medical research. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, this situation forced us to confront our own internal biases. It wasn't just a medical fight, it was a civil rights fight. It changed how we talk about health, how we fund research, and how we care for the vulnerable. It also led to the development of incredibly sophisticated treatments that have turned what was once a certain outcome into a manageable condition. It proved that when we put aside our differences and focus on the science, we can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. Looking back at these moments, a pattern becomes clear. Each health crisis acts as a mirror, reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of the society it hits. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was overextended and brittle, so the crisis broke it. In the 19th century, the industrial world was dirty and disorganized, so the crisis forced it to clean up. In the 20th century, the world was connected but unprepared, so the crisis forced us to build international networks. We often think of progress as a straight line, but in many ways, it's a series of reactions. We move forward because we are pushed by the reality of our own fragility. The massive sewer systems under New York and London aren't just engineering marvels. They are monuments to the people who survived the cholera outbreaks. The international protocols we use to track new viruses today are the legacy of the people of 1918, who realized that a problem anywhere is a problem everywhere. There is also a profound human resilience in these stories. Imagine being a mother in the 17th century, trying to protect your family without the benefit of soap, clean water, or antibiotics. The sheer grit required to keep going is astounding. And yet, people did. They adapted. They found ways to support each other. In the 14th century, even as the world seemed to be ending, people were still writing poetry, painting, and planning for a future they weren't sure they would see. That spirit is the reason we are still here today. One of the most interesting aspects of history is how these crises affect the environment. When the population of Europe dropped in the 1300s, the forests grew back. Rare plants and animals that had been pushed to the edge started to thrive again. When trade stopped in the 17th century, the air in the cities became noticeably clearer. It shows that our presence on this planet has a massive physical impact, and when that presence is scaled back, the Earth responds immediately. This gives us a unique perspective on our current relationship with the natural world. The 20th century also saw the fight against smallpox reach its conclusion. This is perhaps humanity's greatest victory. For thousands of years, this specific ailment had been the scourge of our species. It had taken out kings and peasants alike. It had decided the fate of empires in the Americas and Africa, but through a global, coordinated effort, one that saw even Cold War rivals like the US and the Soviet Union working together, the problem was quite literally wiped off the face of the Earth. In 1980, it was officially declared gone. It is the only human-affecting condition to be completely eradicated by our own efforts. It proves that when we actually decide to solve a problem, we have the tools to do it. Why is it important to talk about these worst years and these devastating crises? Because it provides us with context. When we face our own modern challenges, it's easy to feel like things have never been worse. But history tells a different story. It tells a story of people who faced darkness without even a flashlight of scientific knowledge. It tells of societies that were far more fragile than ours, facing threats that were far more aggressive. And yet, every single time, humanity found a way to bridge the gap. In the 1890s, the third pandemic of the old bubonic variety hit Hong Kong and then spread around the world. This was the first time we were able to use the newly discovered germ theory to actually find the culprit. Researchers from Japan and France raced to identify the microscopic cause. This marked the end of the mystery of health crises. From that point on, we weren't just victims, we were detectives. We started looking at the world through a lens of cause and effect. It changed everything from how we build houses to how we prepare food. The 1920s and 30s saw the development of the first antibiotics. This was a literal miracle. Before this, a simple scratch while gardening, or an infection after a minor surgery could be life-threatening. The arrival of these wonder drugs suddenly shifted the balance of power back to us. For the first time in 3 million years of human existence, we didn't have to fear a minor injury. This led to a massive boom in the global population and a level of individual security that would have been unimaginable to someone in the 1700s. But as we solved the old problems, we created new ones. Our global travel means a threat can move from a small village to a major metropolis in less than 24 hours. Our dense cities mean that once a threat arrives, it can spread with incredible speed. We are living in a high-stakes game where our technology gives us an edge, but our lifestyle increases the difficulty. The health crises of the past aren't just dusty stories in books. They are the training manuals for the future. If you lived through the year 1848, you saw a world in total upheaval. There were revolutions in almost every European capital, and in the background, a massive wave of cholera was sweeping through the population. The stress was unbearable. But out of that year came the modern idea of the social contract. The idea that the government has a responsibility to maintain the basic health and safety of its people. The public health acts that followed were the start of the modern state. We realized that you couldn't have a stable country if your citizens were constantly facing biological threats. Even in the ancient world, people were trying to figure it out. The ancient Greeks and Romans had complex systems of aqueducts and baths. They didn't understand germs, but they understood that clean was better than dirty. When those systems failed during the crises of the 3rd and 6th centuries, the results were catastrophic. This shows that infrastructure is our first line of defense. The pipes under your street and the regulations at your local grocery store are what keep us from slipping back into the world of 541. We should also consider the impact on the arts. The Black Mortality led to the danse macabre, the dance of the vanishing, in European art. It was a way for people to process the fact that everyone, from the king to the beggar, was equally vulnerable. In the 20th century, the polio crisis led to the March of Dimes, a massive cultural and philanthropic movement that changed how we fund science. Every health crisis leaves a cultural footprint. It changes the stories we tell and the things we value. What is the biggest lesson from 2,000 years of health history? It's that cooperation is the only way to win. In the 6th century, the Byzantine and Persian empires were so busy fighting each other that they didn't realize they were both about to be devastated by the same invisible force. In contrast, the 20th century fight against smallpox succeeded because everyone agreed to work together. The biological world doesn't care about our borders, our politics, or our bank accounts. It is a universal challenge, and it requires a universal response. If we look at the year 1200, the world was actually relatively healthy because people were more isolated. The deadliest years only happen when we start moving. The more we interact, the more we share. This is the trade-off of human progress. We want the connection, the trade, and the travel, but we have to pay for it with vigilance. The worst health crises were essentially the growing pains of a global species. We were learning how to be big without being vulnerable. Think about the sheer randomness of it. In 1348, one ship in Sicily changed the course of European history for 500 years. If that ship had been delayed by a week, or if the wind had blown in a different direction, the Renaissance might have happened a century later, or not at all. History is a series of tiny moments that have massive, cascading effects. Health crises are the ultimate examples of this. A single microscopic event can change the language people speak 3 centuries later. The 1957 and 1968 flu events are often forgotten today, but they were massive global events that took millions of lives. They happened during the height of the space age in the Cold War. Even as we were aiming for the moon, we were still being reminded of our terrestrial limitations. These mid-century crises helped us refine the process of creating vaccines quickly, a skill that has become one of our most important modern tools. What about the psychological toll? We often talk about the census numbers, but think about the survivors. In the year 250, during the crisis of the 3rd century, people were watching their world fall apart from both war and a massive pandemic, the plague of Cyprian. The letters from the time reflect a deep sense of despair, but they also show a surge in community spirit. People formed groups to take care of the sick and bury the lost. This era saw a major shift in how people approached faith and community. It shows that when the state fails, people step up to take care of one another. Every crisis we have discussed ended. The sun eventually came out after the ash of 536. The 1340s eventually gave way to the prosperity of the 1400s. The cholera of the 1800s gave way to the clean cities of the 1900s. We are currently the beneficiaries of every single lesson learned during those horrific years. We have the data, the medicine, and the history. As we conclude this deep dive into the most challenging chapters of our biological story, take a look at the world around you. Every hospital, every water treatment plant, and every pharmacy is a hard-won victory in a fight that has been going on for millennia. We are not just subjects of history. We are the successful survivors of it. The worst health crises in human history were not just periods of loss. They were the crucibles that forged modern science and modern society. We have moved from a species that was at the mercy of the wind and the water to a species that can decode the very blueprints of our enemies. We have faced the darkness of the 6th century, the silence of the 14th century, and the industrial struggles of the 19th. And through it all, we have remained persistent, curious, and resilient. Our ancestors survived the years without a sun and the cities without a cure. They did it so that we could be here today, equipped with the knowledge they lacked. So next time you hear about a new health challenge, remember the long view. Remember that we come from a line of people who didn't give up. Remember that we have a 100% success rate in moving past the end of the world. The worst years are behind us, and they have given us the tools to handle whatever comes next. We are a resilient species, and our history is proof that no matter how small the enemy or how large the crisis, we have the capacity to overcome, to learn, and to keep moving forward. The light always returns, the cities always rebuild, and humanity always finds a way to thrive once again.